Ladies and gents, for far too long now, the solver overlords have been ruling our poker lives and telling us what we can and can't do. We humans have been oppressed and downtrodden, and now I say enough is enough. It's time we stood up to these mechanical brutes and listened to our instincts. Not our feelings, not our desires, not our coercive inner demons that want us to station off a stack, but our instincts, the subconscious thought patterns that we've honed over the months and years that we've played this beautiful game. In this episode of Deep Dives, we're going to look at two hands. In the first one, the solver claims that I need to bluff the river. And I knew it would. In game, I knew it was going to say that. And I was like, nah man, I'm not doing it. I'm not fucking doing it this time. In the second hand, the solver is pretty indifferent. It likes to do this. The solver loves to sit on the fence and say, yeah, well, you know, betting and checking just somehow have exactly the same EV. Exactly. It doesn't matter what you do. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. And I think it's much better to bet than to check in the second spot. It's time to stand up and be counted. It's time to seize poker back from our oppressors. If you enjoy the seizing back of poker from the oppressors, don't forget to check out carrotcorner.com for more self-righteous, independent poker thinking. Let's get to the video. In our first hand today, we are dealt the King 10 of spades on the button, and an unknown player opens 2.5x from the hijack. We go for the 3-bet, and they make the call. The flop comes really quite unfavourably for our range. 8-9-5 is the kind of board that tends to do really well for the pocket pair region of the hijack's range, and hands like 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s and jacks are going to be much more concentrated in hijack's range than they are in ours. This means that we're not going to be betting very frequently, but when we do bet, we're still going to want to use a fairly large sizing here because we're building our betting range around the polar nutted overpair region and some bluffs, and therefore lazily betting small because you can't be bothered to learn how poker actually works is not a very good strategy here. Needless to say though, that's what you're going to face super frequently. As we can see from Pio Solver, the betting range is pretty restrained. There is a minimum standard about what we're allowed to bet with. There are certain hands that are just not really going to make it into the betting range at any frequency, and then there are ones that are just going to be higher frequency bluffs. So let's explore how to actually build a betting range here, because it's a little bit counterintuitive as in position. So we have the center hands in our range, 6s, 7s, things like this that are just going to be pretty much always checking. Even pocket 10s. This hand without a club is somewhat mediocre. It's not going to cope too well with big pots. It's not going to cope too well with being raised. These hands are going to want to check pretty frequently. 10-9 is just like the middle of our range. It wants to check as well. On boards like this that hit the out of position player really hard, hands that are normally good on dry boards are just worth a lot less. So if the board was something like 9-3-3, we'd definitely be doing a bit more betting with something like 10-9, but on 9-8-5, this hand is just already a lot weaker and is going to become a lot weaker later on many runouts as well. So when we are considering what to check with, we definitely want to pure check with the middling hands like ace-king, 6s, 7s, 10s, 10-9, that kind of thing. We do start building a lot more value bets as we get up through the region of jacks, queens, kings, etc. But where our bluffs come from in this flop is really quite interesting. Hands that bluff very frequently here are actually big pair draws that satisfy two criteria. The first criteria that hands that are frequently chosen as bluffs fulfill here is that they don't mind being raised that frequently. Have a look at Jack 10. This hand is a pure check, because this is a board where out of position has a substantial value range and can thus build a ton of raises if we get overzealous with our betting. Jack 10 absolutely despises it when it opens the action, faces a raise, and has its EV decimated. Queen 10 is a little bit similar, unless it's the big combo draw, the Queen 10 of clubs. Therefore, when we have these middling, danger zone hands as I call them, in the Carrot Poker School, that's our academic course that you can check out over at carrotcorner.com, we want to be pretty wary about reopening the action. Thus, the more frequent happy bets that don't mind being raised so much are things like King Jack, King Queen, Ace Queen, Ace Jack, big pair draw hands with robust outs that we'd love to hit on the branch where we get called, but we also don't mind bet folding these on the branch where we get raised. Building a betting range here is no easy task. With our actual hand as the King 10 of spades, we can see this is one of the highest frequency bets in our range, and for good reason. On the one hand, King 10 obviously lacks showdown value, the fold equity is very useful. It has some backdoor straight draws with the 10, It has some immediate pair draw outs as well that are quite strong and reasonable to hit, particularly the king, and most importantly, it really doesn't mind getting raised here, and so, well, it doesn't love it, but it's not completely decimated by being raised here, because the idea is you don't have a lot of equity in the first place with this hand. So if you get raised and your equity falls to 0, it's not that much of a drop. It's much better to fall out of a first floor window than an 8th floor window, if you catch my drift. Therefore, we did decide to roll a bit of bet this time. We didn't roll it and we checked back. In truth, I didn't realise that this hand was betting quite so much more often than the average hand in our range is, and I was probably only betting this about 25% of the time in my head here. The turn is the 5 of hearts. This player is still in a position where they can do a ton of leading here. They should absolutely be building little proby sizes here with hands like 10s or 7s or jacks or something like that. They can start doing a bit of block betting here. This makes sense because our range is largely just big cards with some showdown value that will call sometimes, but also if they fold, villain is going to be quite happy with that. So overall, quite a lot of betting expected from the opponent here, and I would be favouring kind of a smaller sizing if you think about what's going on here, range versus range. They decide to check. As our hand was a reasonable bet on the flop, and as we really don't mind facing the check raise here, we're still okay betting the turn. We should roll this in at some frequency, but we should bear in mind that we don't have a ton of value bets in this node, and if we just start betting all the time here, we're going to become a sitting duck for people just stationing us with 7s or with ace queen or whatever it may be, any showdown value hand really, so only mixing in a little bit of bet on this node. The solver agrees that our hand can bet but should usually check. Now when we've reached this node with kings or queens or jacks, you can see that the solver's still doing quite a bit of cagey checking. Why is it checking with jacks here but is almost fully content to bet queens, especially with no club? Well, with jacks, the idea is that you can still be running into hands that are going to check raise you, that are going to beat you. So for example, if you go ahead and bet big here, you can still run into queens. Your equity is just that little bit lower than it is if you have something like queens where you're then value betting against your opponent's jacks. So jacks is still a little bit cuspy. Yes, it's a very good hand, but it's not so good that you absolutely have to bet it here, like you have to bet top boat or ace 5. You can check. You are still getting check raised by a hand that destroys you at some decent frequency here, at least in theory. In practice, if I had jacks here against this pool, I'm looking to play exploitatively. I'm looking to take advantage of their capped ranges in as many spots as possible. I would probably just go for a pure bet on this node. So I don't mind betting jacks all of the time, but with my hand, I'm still just kind of indifferent. This spot might be a little bit overfolded. There could be some argument here to just wanting to bet with king 10 of spades. If you said to me, do you know what, Pete, against 100 Russian cash pool, maybe you should just go ahead and bet with this hand here. I don't hate that. However, I would like to point one thing out, and that is that I think people expect the in-position player to bet over pairs on the flop more often than they do. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword when considering how much fold equity we really have here. We do decide to check behind a second time, and the river becomes the 5 of diamonds. When our opponent checks here, I had two thoughts simultaneously. The first one was, I think I'm supposed to bluff here, and the reason I had that thought is that generally speaking, when your opponent has checked you multiple times and the board isn't horrible for you, you're going to have a mandatory bluff with your pure air hands if you were the pre-flop aggressor. That's because your range just generally maintains enough strength on this node that villain is folding more than the break-even point for your bluffs on nodes like this. This is something we refer to in the Carrot Poker School as river blunder theorem, meaning that it would be a blunder not to bet in GTO in nodes like this. However, this isn't a massively favourable spot for our range. It's a relatively neutral environment for each player now. I don't think it's mandatory to bet with every airball hand here. Some are going to block folding range more than others. For example, if we have a queen, we're probably going to block more folds than if we have a king, for the simple reason that the pre-flop caller defends against 3-bets more with queen high air or ace queen or something like that than they do with a king in their hand. They tend to 4-bet ace king, for example, pre-flop. So this hand not having a queen and being kind of airy, I'm pretty sure you're meant to bet here in equilibrium, but we'll find out in just a second. My second thought that I had here was, I don't want to bluff. And I had to be really careful with that thought, because when I have thoughts that pull me in the opposite direction to what I think is theoretically correct, I need to carefully examine them and make sure that this isn't like a mental game leak, this isn't some kind of discomfort, and nor is it some kind of narrow tunnel vision thought process like he's just going to have sixes and he's just going to call. You need to be careful about things like that where your hand reading is too narrow. The reason I didn't want to bet here was that I really felt that my opponent was going to get to this spot with too many hands that they should actually be value betting on the river. I think things like 7s, 6s, even 4s, pairs like this are going to want to bet the river for value here. even though we're meant to have some overpairs on this node, we're going to have a ton of ace x bluff catchers that have to call. So I think when you're out of position here with a hand like 7s, you're probably just meant to bet. I think if you have an 8 or a 9, you're probably just meant to bet, but sometimes population is going to check those hands on the river. The other reason that I didn't want to bluff for here was I was worried that hands like ace queen, which should probably usually fold in GTO to a big bet here, would just click call because I've checked back twice and it doesn't look like I'm repping anything. While I'm meant to play my overpairs this way, I really don't think I would against this pool, and I really don't think I'm expected to. This is villain strategy first of all, and you can see that hands like pocket 7s and pocket 6s and even 4s sometimes are absolutely pure bets here. Moreover, villain is pretty much always meant to bluff with hands like jack 10, jack 9, queen 10 or queen jack. What this means for me in reality is that I'm facing a hand that's just auto-clicking call in the form of 6s or something, way more frequently than I should be, and moreover, I might even win sometimes against the more passive recreational side of pool here by checking my king 10 and running into queen 10 or queen jack. I don't think there'll be enough folding going on here, so for example, if we were to go ahead and let's say overbet, bet 150% of the pot, villain is meant to almost always fold ace queen, pretty much always fold ace jack, fold with 4s 100% of the time, never have 7s or 6s to call with. I just feel like I'm getting bluff caught way more than this. If we consider a sizing like B75, I also don't think this is going to be good. Yep, ace queen almost always meant to fold, definitely not happening. Again, never running into 7s or 6s here. I can see why the solver wants to go ahead and bluff here, but I have to say, solver, I really disagree. I'm sick of you bullying me. I'm sick of you putting your solvery ideas in my head and making me think I have to do everything you say all the time. I'm going to break free, man. I'm going to do what I want. So I decided to check back and make what I would call an exploitative non-bluff. I know you guys are absolute fiends for Showdown and you don't like it when I hide the results from you, although I do that accidentally. You have to understand I do a lot of private coaching and the student is usually so focused on just getting the meat out of the lesson. They want to learn the hows and the whys that I don't care about what their opponents have quite frequently. I really couldn't give a shit. And so we don't even look at showdowns. Here though, we will, because I know you guys like it. This is a hand that sadly probably would have folded to a bet on the river, although it may not have, may have just been looked up here. Opponent may have just thought, well, they're not repping anything. They wouldn't bluff with ace queen or ace king here, so I'm just going to call. But overall, I'm still happy with the give up. I think it's an over defended spot, and it's one where we just want to go ahead and say, no, our fold equity is not as good as it should be. If this was a single raise pot, this would be quite different. Ranges in single raise pots do tend to overfold a lot by the river after they check multiple times. 3-bet pots, there's a bit more showdown value in there. There's a higher density of stuff that can catch bluffs basically. So here, I just don't think it's really the case. Our second hand of the day features the pocket potatoes. If you want to know why the 10s are called pocket potatoes, too bad, it's an inner circle secret. We go ahead and open the hijack here to 2.2 big blinds. It's raised by the small blind and folded by the big blind. We make the call and we go to a flop of 9-5-3. This flop is nowhere near as bad for the pre-flop 3-better as the last one that we looked at. There only being 1 to 2 middling cards instead of 3, and those cards being more disconnected is going to give a little bit of reprieve here for the small blind range, and we're going to see a higher c-bet frequency than before, as this range is still building its value component around jacks, queens, kings, aces, etc. for the most part. It's going to go ahead and big bet or check raise here as the primary means of getting money into the pot. There's not going to be small betting in this situation in GTO, though your bozo opponents will do that all the time. If somebody does bet small here, you should basically never fold. Just don't fold. Just say no, and then win the pot later. Don't take that shit, guys. If I catch someone folding to one of these third pot size bets when they're in position in a 3-bet pot this week, I'm gonna be mad, and I'm gonna be watching all of you play. I spy on you guys all the time to make sure that you're playing well. Don't let me down. Villain goes ahead and bets about half pot here, and we have a pretty standard call with 10s. If this was later position, I think you can begin to raise hands like this. Effectively, the later the position and the wider the ranges, the more worse hands Villain's going to have to continue with against your raise, and it's going to be okay. But here I think 10s is just a pure call. I think something like jacks might be a raise at some frequency, certainly queens. Then we can build some raises around our sets and some bluffs as well as a few hybridy weird hands like the 4-5 sometimes perhaps, although I'm not too sure about that one. We'll take a look at it in a second. Jack of clubs comes on the turn, and this is the key decision point for this hand. Villain checks, and what would you do? Would you bet? Would you check? If you did bet, what kind of sizings would you be using? And what's your thought process? Pause the video if you want, have a think about it. So in this spot, I decided that betting small would be the primary thing that GTO would do if it bet, but it would also be happy checking. I was pretty damn confident that there wouldn't be a big EV difference between betting my hand and checking my hand in theory, but then again, in theory, I'm expected to get check raised quite a lot. The out of position player is meant to check the turn with sets and with flushes at some frequency. They're meant to check bomb the ace king of clubs instead of always betting. They're meant to check bomb with the ace of clubs king of spades instead of always betting. They're meant to be a real nuisance to play against, and it shouldn't just be safe for us to bet for denial here with a little bit of thin value. However, I think it's much safer to do that in reality than it is in GTO. So this is a spot where the solver's going to say, you're indifferent, do whatever you want. And I say middle finger to the solver, man. I say no. I say I'm going to bet because I think it's way better. Let's explore this in a bit more detail in the sim now. So it turns out that this is actually one of these boards where we don't do a lot of raising at all. This is their strategy. So they're meant to use the big bet. I eliminated the small bet because I know it's not really going to use it here for the small blind. So it's using this 55% pot c-bet here with a lot of its range, much more of its range than was recommended on the more connected flop that we looked at in hand 1. So they go for the bet this time. We have the pocket tens. Big mistake to do anything but call. Raising is going to hemorrhage a lot of EV, and there's actually really no hand in our range here that's as good to raise as it is to call. We're in position, it's a low-ish SBR. Our opponent's bet with a fairly polarized range. I guess raising is just kind of off the table in position here. Out of position, you do see this thing a little bit more frequently, but yeah, in position, not so much. Jack of clubs comes on the turn, and villain is meant to mainly use small bets. This is generally the case when you have a flush turn. It's going to add a lot of polarization to the in-position player's range here, and it's going to neutralize the nut advantage that was formerly held here by the small blind through having all of the overpairs. So they do check on this occasion, and as you can see here, our hand is a dead even mix between bet and check. We're allowed to bet small and just get that little bit of thin value denial, etc. And that's with the presupposition that our opponent is actually slow playing a bunch of these pairs and jamming them on us and ripping the draw on us and playing a flush like this at some frequency as well. So there's a ton of hands in our opponent's range here that we really would not want to see, yet the solver is still happy to block bet anyway because it knows it's a trade-off. The solver knows that when it float bets here in position, that's what this is technically called in Carrot Poker School language, a float bet, when you've been checked to by the out position player. It knows that when you make this float bet, you are running into this bad stuff, but the fold equity is just so useful. There's so many combos of overcards here that just have to hit the muck. There's also a little bit of ability to value bet here because ace king with a club is going to call you. So it's mainly denial. It's a little bit of value as well. I wouldn't say there's any bluff element here to betting tens. Villain's not folding a stronger hand than this, but there's enough going on that third pot or quarter pot or something is going to be absolutely fine. I don't agree that the EV of tens is the same for betting and checking here as the solver indicates. So for example, when we're checked to here, it says there's no EV difference whatsoever. I just don't think that's the case. That's another middle finger to the solver spot. I'm going to bet every time because I think bet is better than check. If you think that one line is better than the other and you don't think that you're giving anything away long term, that there's going to be any repercussions, which I absolutely don't in a pool like this, then you should always take the best line. Don't kid yourself into thinking that just because you can RNG for some spots that are close, that you should just defer your reasoning to the RNG. You should just say, I don't know what to do, I'll just roll without considering which play is better. It's really important in this spot to do the analysis, and I think it's quite clear that pool reacts really badly to this bet. They don't do enough raising, they've not built enough strong hands into their range in the first place. I love this bet as a pure action, and this is a great example of doing something all the time that the solver says you should only do some of the time, and that, my friends, is a deviation. That's where the EV is in poker. It's making those kinds of departures from the solver's recommendation without worrying about it breathing down your neck and silently judging you from its pedestal in the sky. Since you love results, I can confirm the villain did fold here. This one went our way. We win one, we lose one. Like the exploitative give up in the first hand, like this pure action instead of a mix here on the turn. Look out for exploitative deviations in your own game. Where have you recently declined the solver's advice? Let me know in the comments. Where have you outsmarted it and said, no solver, you don't know what's going on in my world. In my world, it's actually better to do this. It's a really cool skill to have, so work on it. If you are enjoying this series, deep dives, then check out the Carrot Poker School on carrotcorner.com for an extremely, immensely deep dive into the theory of no limit hold'em cash games. This is the comprehensive course that's helped so many players in our private Discord achieve their goals. Getting the course will also get you access to that gated community where you can get access from numerous other coaches and professional poker players, as well as peers also working hard on their game. We'll be back with another video soon on Carrot Corner Poker Education. Until then, good luck at the tables and have fun giving the middle finger to the solver. Bye for now.